Every empire falls. That is certain, no matter how long they reigned and how far their rule stretched. From the Romans who ruled for over 1,000 years, to the Ottomans who spanned continents, and the USSR that changed the political landscape of the modern world. So is the empire we're living under today also crumbling?
Yes. The key question is how fast.
We have bounties beyond those known to the people of any other day.
American democracy is obviously limping on both feet.
America is not the greatest country in the world anymore.
The US empire is falling, and there are 3 symptoms of its impending demise that we can see from looking to the past. Let's start with the oldest of the bunch. These videos are made possible by our supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to help us tell more stories like this, you can become a paying member through the link in the description. Now back to the video. The Roman Empire oversaw the lives of millions of people. Remnants of its great reign still stand in cities across the world, a testament to their reach and influence in the lands they conquered.
Never has Rome been greater or stronger than now.
But then, after 1,000 years of domination, it fell. And just like Rome wasn't built in a day, it didn't fall in one either. Instead, the fall of the Roman Empire was death by 1,000 cuts. But there's one factor in particular we're going to look at: internal decay.
At the height of its grandeur and its glory, a civilization so powerful it could never be conquered from without. Yet it found the seeds of its destruction within itself.
There was a huge disparity between the lives of the elite and the commoners. Rome's elites lived in grand estates, hosting lavish, decadent banquets where they'd feast on peacock tongue and wine from naked waiters.
Every one of these senatorial families has holdings all over the Roman Empire. They're the equivalent of small multinational corporations. They are wealthy in a way that is impossible for us to understand.
The poor lived a very different reality. They worked menial jobs and lived mostly on bread and porridge, living in overcrowded, badly built buildings, prone to collapse and spreading disease.
The games are all about Roman emperors giving the people what they need, and it's always described as bread and circuses. They had to feed the people of Rome, but once they were fed, they had to be entertained.
Let the games begin!
There were famines, peasant uprisings, and slavery, and the Roman tax system disproportionately impacted the lower classes, while the wealthy often avoided taxes through exemption or corruption.
This is now a new era of Roman history. Rome is no longer what it was. Rome is in decline.
The middle class was shrinking, and the economy became increasingly polarized between the very rich and the very poor, all fueling resentment and instability. So what does this tell us about the US?
The home they've always dreamed of, the happiest investment they have ever made.
The middle class was once a symbol of the American dream. It meant owning your own home with a white picket fence, a car, kids going to school, a perceived ease and quality of life that couldn't be found anywhere else in the world, and that anyone could achieve so long as they worked hard enough.
We are a prospering people, wherever we live, or earn our livelihood.
But for the past few decades, that's all become increasingly out of reach for lots of Americans.
Some people skipping meals because they simply can't afford it.
The number of people experiencing homelessness in a single night went up 12%.
Every year, hundreds of thousands of people are literally asking for donations to afford medical treatment.
Our roads and bridges are crumbling, our airports are out of date, and the vast majority of our seaports are in danger of becoming obsolete.
But Americans from the grocery store to the gas station are seeing their budgets tighten every single month.
And the changes suggested would mean higher taxes for the average American family, widening America's already massive income gap.
90% of the wealth is right here in the top. And then the lower middle class, they've got 0.3% of a piece. Yeah, they have some crumbs there. And the poorest, they have no pie. In fact, they have less than no pie. They actually have a bill for pie. They're in pie debt.
They're struggling to meet rent or mortgage payments, repay college loans, to repay loans for a car.
While the wealthy have become steadily wealthier, wages have been stagnant and costs of living have surged. And it's not like these changes are mutually exclusive. It's off the backs of workers, off the exploitation of the American masses, that the wealthy continue to engorge themselves.
Elon Musk has officially become the richest person in the world. His net worth has crossed the $400 billion mark.
companies buying out the housing market, insurance companies making healthcare unaffordable, politicians taking money from lobbies to protect corporate interests and fill their own pockets, and the working class is well aware.
Hoarding wealth is so harmful, so unethical, so rage-inducing.
Billionaires should not exist. So you talk about teacher's salary, $2,000 in rent, $400 car payment, you got insurance, you got groceries, electricity. Like, I don't understand how people are affording life right now.
For 5 stitches, $3,800.
What?
Like, it's so freaking hard to live here.
North America is one big scam.
And then there's the internal social and political decay. People have become disenchanted with the illusion of American democracy, of its promises of equality, of equal opportunity for all as long as you pick yourself up by your bootstraps.
You can see a sea of people all united under one cause. They are protesting for racial equality.
The murder of a healthcare executive has led to online popularity for the shooter.
Mangione has emerged in some circles as a sympathetic figure fighting the system.
All this leads to political instability, economic trouble, and social unrest, which weakens the empire at its core. But an empire is bigger than its center. It's a network of vassal states serving the core's interests, and keeping all those entities in check is done through both soft power and hard power. That brings us to symptom number 2. To understand soft power and how it plays into imperial decline, let's look at the Ottomans.
It was a huge empire, dominated by a Turkish dynasty that had its origins in Asia Minor.
The Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful and enduring empires in history, spanning 3 continents at its height. It was a hub of cultural and scientific innovation, producing advancements in medicine, astronomy, architecture, and engineering that changed the world.
They ruled a considerable mix of peoples and faiths.
There was no great history of ethnic tension, even though there was a history of massively complicated ethnic and confessional coexistence.
It lasted almost 600 years, until it didn't. One factor that contributed to its demise was its waning influence over the peoples and territories it had under its control, also known as the loss of soft power. Soft power is about being more persuasive than coercive, about getting people to comply without using force. In the case of the Ottomans, it was a delicate balance of diplomacy and cultural influence. But over time, the empire's ability to foster loyalty among diverse groups was eroding, aided by rising nationalism within these communities.
The Greeks were the first to rebel against the Ottoman shackles.
The minute you start getting a political world, this system is going to break down. And that is what happens in the 19th century, and that is the great conundrum for the empire.
People stopped buying into the vision of the empire and began to break off and pursue their own interests. Now, the US has been really good at soft power. It began after World War II, when the US positioned itself as a global leader promoting democracy, economic growth, and cultural influence.
Joe's the king because he can buy more with his wages than any other worker on the globe.
It is the most important idea that the United States has contributed to the world. Citizens of every rank can expect to have a better, richer, happier life.
It helped rebuild war-torn Europe, set up major global institutions where it continues to hold significant power, and has exported music, television, and pop culture across the world for decades. And the messaging of this soft power has been consistent and clear.
Shining city upon a hill. After 200 years, she's still a beacon, still a magnet for all who must have freedom.
But for soft power to work, for people to buy into the fantasy and want to participate, they need to see credibility and moral consistency. Now, just to be clear, the US has violated the principles it preaches since its founding, not to mention since its emergence as a global hegemon. It seems the majority of people were willing to overlook that and buy into the American dream. But the illusion is falling apart.
The mob tore down scaffolding, battled their way through the last line of police defense, and broke into the Capitol building itself.
At home, the land of democracy, liberty, and human rights hasn't kept up the best image in recent years, and it's not any better abroad. The US has spearheaded and overseen devastating wars, crippling debt, human rights violations, and environmental damage across the world. which has made it hard to take preaching of democracy and freedom seriously.
America no longer charts a course and therefore has lost all rights to set it, and even more so to impose it on others.
Disillusionment with American values is growing, and in its panic, the empire continues to thrash and bully to stay relevant. That's where hard power comes in, and brings us to the third symptom of the fall of an empire. This one is best illustrated by the Soviet Union. Now, the USSR ideologically rejected the idea of imperialism, but the reality is that it looked and acted like an empire.
The Soviet Communist Party has not faced a serious internal threat to its political rule since the 1920s.
There was a centralized authority overseeing expansion and control of a collection of republics and satellite states, where movements for autonomy were suppressed. What tethered these states together was a unified ideology, communism. But it was also hard power, military might. And that costs money.
It is here, in Red Square, that the superpower Soviet Union holds its military parades, displaying its might for all the world to see.
At its strongest, the Soviet Union had 5 million soldiers stationed around the Union, and pursued wars and conquests to maintain and expand its reach. Then there's all the money spent on the arms race during the Cold War. Money spent on propping up parties in proxy wars across the world, and money spent on wars like Afghanistan, a protracted 10-year-long conflict that cost them $50 billion.
The superpower from the north occupies Afghanistan with more than 100,000 troops, a modern mechanized army.
Eventually, the cost of keeping the empire in check became unmanageable, and the economy took a hit. By the late 80s, people within the Union were struggling with soaring poverty and a low quality of life, with no strategic wins to show for all that money spent. Military and ideological overextension drained not only the economy, but public morale as well, until people got fed up.
In Moscow, the hammer and sickle is lowered for the last time.
Sounds familiar.
All estimates agree that the cost will be at least $1 trillion. The Bush administration never expected the war to drag on as long as it has.
The fall of Kabul to the Taliban marked an abrupt end to America's longest war. The war cost American taxpayers about $1 trillion.
The US carried out long, brutal, expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with nothing to show for it except instability and devastation and financial loss. Then there's the constant ideological wars. The war on communism, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on China and Russia. There's a constant boogeyman in the ether to justify US military spending. The US maintains the most bases in the world at over 700 and spends hundreds of billions of dollars on the military every year, more than the next 10 countries combined. It's funding Ukraine in its war against Russia. It might support Taiwan in a war against China. Billions of dollars spent, and we can't remember the last war the US has actually won. But last year, an undeniable awakening happened.
This has been a senseless and a deliberate slaughter, a genocide, and it is happening on our dime.
For over a year, Americans and the rest of the world have watched US politicians from both sides of the aisle cheer on and fund the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza to the tune of billions of dollars. It has shattered the idea that the US is a beacon of justice and human rights, and irreversibly cemented the hypocrisy of American moral exceptionalism. The empire has never been so exposed. And it's shown Americans, who back in the imperial core continue to struggle to live decent, dignified lives, where all their tax money is going, and where it's definitely not. The US has been an empire since its very conception. From colonizing Native American land, to conquering territories overseas, to dominating world politics through global institutions, military might, corporate interests, and foreign meddling. Of all the empires that have risen and fallen, none have come close to having the reach and power of the US. So the idea of it losing its hold over the world seems inconceivable. But while all these symptoms are unfolding and the US empire erodes from within and without, it's not doing so in a vacuum. It does so in the middle of a global shift in geopolitics, in a world that's becoming increasingly multipolar, with countries choosing new allies, new frameworks for collaboration, even new currencies.
The aim of the alliance is to challenge the economic and political monopoly of the West.
All of which is not good for the US. See, the way the global system is designed is, in many ways, for the benefit of America. From reliance on the dollar, US aid, and US debt, to fear of US sanctions, vetoes, and foreign intervention, we live in a world full of systems and institutions designed to prop up the US and keep the rest of the world in check. But these systems aren't going to live forever because they're inherently unsustainable. They rely on the exploitation of peoples across the world and within the imperial core, and bank on them buying into the bit that all this is necessary, is better for them, and protects them. And as life becomes more unaffordable, countries more destabilized, governments more autocratic, and our environment more unlivable, people eventually wake up. And that's usually the beginning of the end.